Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this new webinar by the International Energy Agency. Today we'll continue our journey on energy statistics and energy modeling, looking more specifically at the supply of primary energy for energy systems and discussing hydrocarbon sector or oil and gas mostly today. So I will be joined with by my colleague Rebecca, who's been working in the oil and gas sector for many years and who is a modeler and an analyst of supply for oil and gas in energy systems. I'm just reminding you where we are. So after last week on energy statistics, this week we've been focused on energy modeling, starting with an introduction, then looking how at the future demand of energy with the building sector. So how do we expect the need for electricity for lighting or powering appliances to evolve in the future? How do we expect the need for fossil fuels to evolve in the future for building sector? But this applies to all the end sectors, so industry, agriculture, residential services and others. So this is what we discussed on Wednesday. Yesterday, the session was dedicated to the power sector. So once we know how much electricity we need to provide, how do we develop the infrastructure? How do we have the capacity to meet this demand? And then how do we dispatch and decide which type of plant shall be operating at what time, depending on intermittency, for example, depending on on load base and peak demand time. And we also discussed the economics and the integration of variable renewables like solar PV. Today, we are closing the loop of discussing the entire energy system by looking at the supply of primary energy and how does that enter into the modeling exercise. Next week, we will meet, and I'm sorry, I see there is a mistake on on this slide. We'll meet on Tuesday and Wednesday. I'll confirm by email and WhatsApp, but starting at same time, 9 a.m., but it will be Tuesday and Wednesday. And it will be sessions dedicated to modeling, but taught by academic partners who are doing some research and some further analysis on different topics or different approaches of energy modeling. So, as usual, please raise your hand or use the Q&A functionality for any question or email if you want later. Today, we will discuss a bit how price work and what is their role in this supply of fossil fuel module of our energy system. Then we'll describe a bit this model, its structure, its modules and sub-modules. We will look at NPV or net present value calculations, so which are economical consideration, as well as production profiles of each of the different oil fields and related investment. We'll break for first questions and answers, and then we will discuss in the second half the refinery module and a key topic, which are implications for sustainability. Before we enter into that, I'd like to share a few scene setting information on the oil and gas sector in Africa today. So based on IEA data, this is the map of the continent with the main producers. You would see in dark blue the OPEC members, and the top producers that, as you would know, include Nigeria, Angola, Algeria, Libya, etc. And we have other countries, including Ghana, which are not part of OPEC, but which are also important oil producers, at least from the data we have from the year 2020. So this was crude oil production. When we look at demand for oil products, you can see here on this map the top African countries in terms of oil consumption. So all that account for more than 2.5% of the total. And you would find, without much surprise, you would find the most advanced economies of the continent, including North Africa, including South Africa, Nigeria, and you would also find some other countries like Angola, which is a very heavy producer of oil, and others like Kenya. If we look at a per capita base rather than the absolute value of oil consumed, we would find other countries with small population like Mauritius, Botswana, Namibia, or Gabon. And we will also have our top advanced economies, including, for example, South Africa and the Northern African countries. So this was specific to oil production and consumption for Africa. If we try to put Africa in perspective of the global trends, you would see here that the share of Africa in some indicators like supply of oil or trade is below 10%, while the share of Africa in total oil demand or refining production is below 5%. So Africa is still accounting for limited, still a limited role in the global oil perspective. But behind those numbers, which are related to the year 2018, there have been some recent evolution. So if we look at how this evolved between the year 2010 and 2000 on the left, and if we look at the evolution between 2018 versus 2010, we can see that demand in Africa has been constantly growing, but production that was rising over the first decade of the century has then been decreasing between the year 2018 and 2010, and as a result, exports of net exports of products that were positive in the first decade have become negative, meaning that Africa has been importing more products than what it's been able to produce and to export. So that's a recent trend, and you would see again role of large key producers like Nigeria and Angola. Now discussing discoveries and expanding the scope to natural gas. So when we look at oil here on this figure, you can see the discoveries of new resources over the past decade, and sub-Saharan Africa is in red. So there have been some years where big discoveries were made in the continent, like 2012 or 2013-14, where in terms of share, Africa was accounting for 20 to 30% of all the oil discovered at a global level. But the really strong and striking picture is about natural gas, because if we look at this period, 2011 to 2018, Africa has accounted for 40% of all the new gas resources in the world. And this, according to our analysis, is really a key topic, and something that is very important in the specific case of Ghana, but beyond, because we really expect Africa to be able to take a bigger share of the global natural gas production. So this means Ghana can produce more, can be a large exporter, and can be able to provide the international markets. But this resource, which is abundant, can also be used in the continent and at a local level for power generation, of course, but also for to be used as an entrance to industry and to heat production, for example. So there are many applications that would mean that this locally available resource can really bring Africa at a turning point in the use of natural gas. So what could the future look like in terms of production for both oil and gas? Our analysis anticipate that the oil production of the continent will remain stable at around 8 million barrels per day, with some adjustments between producing countries, Nigeria remaining somehow stable or increasing a bit, Libya being able to step up from the past years, and new countries coming online too. But again, the striking point is really about natural gas, where we expect a doubling by 2035 and even a higher increase by 2040, with those new projects coming online, Mozambique and Tanzania, but also Egypt, also Senegal and Mauritania, and other places of the continent that would be able to bring online much more gas resources. So if we come back to oil, so we expect a stable production. We can look more specifically at oil in the continent and take all the value chain. So we have oil production that we expect to remain stable over the future, but we also expect oil demand to rise. And this, in our modeling exercise, comes from our bottom-up approach. So if we look at transport, if we look at demographic trends, if we look at how much people will be interested in using cars, passenger cars, but also freight with trucks on the roads, with planes and ships. So looking at all the end use and the services we expect people to want, we project the oil demand for the continent to double by 2040. And then if we have a look at the midstream part, so the refineries, and we see that it would increase, but not as much as oil demand. So that would mean that imports of products is expected to be at above 2 million barrels per day by 2040 to be able to meet this oil demand. So we expect sub-Saharan Africa to remain a net importer of oil products through 2040. One interesting implication for governments is how much money can you make out of those resources. So here we will look at the top 10 producers in Africa of oil and gas, and we will look year after year at the income for the government. You can see the results here, and what is striking is that it's been highly variable, reaching sometimes over 300 billion USD in high years and 60 billion in low years. And this has tended to lead to high levels of expenditure when there was an upward dynamic, but more difficult to decrease or to put under pressure the government expenditure in periods where incomes were lower. And so this is really a strong call for governments to diversify further their economy and not to over rely on their oil and gas production because of prices volatility, because of the very strong international competition for lighter crudes with or with also U.S. tight oil production, which is really a strong competitor to any other oil production on the globe. And what could the future look like? Again, here we've taken a scenario approach. Under our stated policy scenario, we could see an income from oil and gas to come back to the rise, but not reaching the highest levels observed over the past decade. But under another scenario that we called faster energy transition with less demand for oil, and then we would expect a lower price for oil, we would see that African countries could not make more money than what was done in 2017 at the lowest level of the past decade. So again, that's a strong call for carefully managing the revenues generated by oil and gas resources. One last analysis related to this international competition for oil and gas is that we observe that increasingly the projects that come online are short cycle projects and small size projects. So you would see the evolution that the average time to market, so the difference between the time, the date, the resource or the oil field is discovered and the time the first barrels are produced, this is really shortening. So we see investors that want to get their money back in a short period of time. And if Sub-Saharan Africa wants to be competitive in this world and to attract these funds, it needs to ensure that processes are efficient, that licensing are given in a very responsive and quick manner. And then there is also, as we can see at a global level, a preference for smaller resources size, so smaller projects, not such big as what we could see in the past in terms of million barrels of fields. And Africa might also need to be in the same trajectory. So this is the orange line, to be in a downward trajectory or to remain at small size levels rather than increasing as we've been observed, should Africa want to be very competitive and to attract investors for developing those oil and gas resources in the future. So after this first information, I'd like to ask you a few questions and go to our Menti usual tool. So you should be able to see the Menti question with a new code today. So please go to www.menti.com and use the code 11777869. And we are starting with a question related to the modeling exercise and how to make such projections, how to build some modeling tools for oil and gas and energy supply modeling. And the question you are asked is to you, what are the key parameters to take into account when we do modeling of the supply? Okay, so thank you for your answers. You are ranking resources and reserves at a high level, then demand, prices. So again, there is no bad answer. All very good. We'll see how resources and reserves are different one from another, but these are indeed some key information. Demand is also very important because demand is driving supply, and we'll see that prices have a role in between the two. Project profitability is of course very important and related to prices as well, as we'll see in a second. Okay, another question is to you, are we close to reaching a peak in global oil production? And if so, would you expect that to happen very soon or not soon at all? So here we have on purpose not given some quantitative statement. I know that very soon is vague and not soon at all is also very vague, but it's just to get a feeling of what you think will be the future for global oil production. Okay, so we have some people thinking very soon, other well, a bit later or not soon at all. Well, the IEA does not have the answer to that question. We are tracking, of course, month after month and year after year, the global oil production. We are also collecting data and analyzing reserves, resources. But what we have analyzed and written so far is that um, when it comes to conventional oil, it seems that the world has already reached a peak a few years ago, but other oil resources have come online, including tight oil from the US or others. So we have not seen a peak in global oil production so far. In the future, will that come? Maybe a question to ask ourselves is what would entail this peak? Is it availability of resource or is it a peak in demand? And we are more thinking that demand might drive supply. And I just recall the former minister of oil from Saudi Arabia saying that the age of stone did not end because there was no more stone on Earth. It's because humanity moved to another technology and the need for stone declined. So it's most likely that a peak and a decline in global oil production would be subsequent to a peak and decline in global oil demand. And we will see that if we want to meet our climate goals, there is a need to sharply reduce oil consumption and oil demand. And Rebecca will be able to share more with you on that when she joins us at the end of this session. Okay, and one related question to you: do we still need oil even in a scenario which is a sustainable development scenario, so aligned with our climate targets and goals to reduce CO2 emissions? Okay, thank you for your answers. We'll see what our modeling exercise give. And please keep in mind that we've been working on a sustainable development scenario, but you always need to really look what concretely is behind this scenario. So historically, the IEA SDS, or Sustainable Development Scenario, had the target to be taking into account climate goals, including the Paris Agreement at COP21, with the aim to limit global warming to 2 degrees and with most efforts to keep it under 1.5 degrees by the end of the century as compared to pre-industrial levels. And concretely, in terms of quantitative target for our scenario, this was meaning to have a world which is net zero emitting of CO2 and greenhouse gases by the second half of the century. So let's say around to the year 2075. We are now working on another scenario, and the report will be out in 2 weeks, which is net zero by 2050, because many governments on the world have taken such a pledge to reach a net zero level by 2050, which would give us more chances to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees by the end of the century. So that being said, Rebecca will be able to share a bit more what our results give under those new scenarios. So depending on how ambitious they are, but as of today, the world is highly dependent on oil for transport, but also for other parts of the economy. So whatever target we take, will need to reduce from our today's level, which are very high. And the more ambitious the target is, the more sharp the decline would need to be. Then the question is, do we still need to invest in some new resources, or shall we just start declining from existing fields, or just investing in existing fields? We'll discuss those questions in a second with a presentation from Rebecca. So thank you for your answers. And I'm now giving the floor to my colleague Rebecca to introduce you to the basics of supply modeling and oil and gas modeling in our tools.
Hello and welcome to this subsection as we talk through supply modeling, and specifically fossil fuel supply modeling in the IEA's World Energy Supply Model. In the course of this first section, we're going to detail more information and background on the prices and demand supply iterations that we go through in the model. We will step through first, taking a look at the current picture of the oil and gas industry today. And what you see here is a view of the ownership of oil and gas, both the proven plus probable reserves, the production, and the upstream investment by company type from 2018. On the left-hand side, we see oil, and the right-hand side, we see gas. And this is broken apart by the industry landscape for oil and gas, and it's typically characterized into the majors, producers like Shell, Total, Eni, BP, ExxonMobil, and others, independents, companies like Tullow, the North American shale independents, including Oxy and EOG, and also national oil companies that are split between both independent NOCs and NOCs that are more closely tied to their states. Fossil fuels still can provide an opportunity for energy access under the right conditions. However, increasing attention and import is being paid to reducing emissions across the sector. NOCs on the whole account for well over half of global production and an even larger share of future and existing reserves. As we take a look at the view of remaining technical recoverable resources for both oil and gas, we'll step through the picture of gas first. Currently, we have about slightly less than 20% of total resources have been produced to date. With oil. And oil is broken apart into conventional, extra heavy oil and bitumen, tight oil, NGLs, or natural gas liquids, and kerosene oil. On gas, much of gas is on the conventional side. Overall, we've consumed less than 20% of the oil and gas that's estimated to be developable. Significant sources and resources still remain, particularly in conventional and extra heavy oil or bitumen. And gas resources, previously thought as a waste stream many decades ago, have grown to be considered a potentially important transition fuel as we look forward to clean energy transitions. Shown here is the resource breakout for both oil and gas. And overall, there's not a question of whether there are resources to develop. The question that we're going to dive into in this slide and future slides as we go through the course of this module is at what cost and what does future demand look like, and how the balances of those two factors play into global supply. So we'll explore this in much of the discussion, but first turn to the question of emissions from oil and gas operations. Fossil fuels can provide an opportunity for energy access under the right conditions. However, increasing importance and attention is being paid to reducing emissions across this sector. In 2020, we've seen many countries, including China, Japan, and Korea, make net zero carbon emission pledges. The IEA has analyzed emissions from oil and natural gas, including a recently updated methane tracker, which shows country and regional breakouts of the primary emission pathways. For oil and natural gas production, most emissions from operations are caused by the release of methane to the atmosphere. Methane on a 100-year lifetime has approximately a 30 times greater warming potential than carbon dioxide. And we estimate, based on our analysis, that more than 70% of these methane emissions could be abated at no net cost to the operator, or essentially could be captured and sold on as methane in the existing operations. A long-time area of focus, flaring has received even greater scrutiny and attention in the last few years. In 2019, about 150 BCM of gas was flared, or more gas than is currently used by the entire continent of Africa. Flaring of associated gas occurs sometimes in the event of an emergency or a non-standard operational event. However, most flaring occurs due to the lack of a gas market or infrastructure built directly to the operation site. Recent geospatial analysis by many individuals and highlighted by the IEA indicates that more than half of flaring occurs within 20 kilometers of existing gas pipelines. Further, if flares were unlit or operating in poor conditions, even more emissions than are currently estimated may be released. We're going to step into next the IEA's World Energy Model and an overview of the supply model. As we turn to the supply model, we consider what must be taken into account in order to assess supply. Some of these key elements in the module include demand across the sectors, price, available resources, and the cost to produce those resources, or essentially the economic viability of the projects. Government policies in particular have a hand in driving demand for a product stream, as they help to drive customers and consumers or help to set future CO2 pricing, for example. The price may be sufficiently stimulating to bring in new investments into a sector, and the price and supply are intricately linked and depend on resources, production costs, and overall policies. In the World Energy Model, we assess a price scenario that maintains a relatively static path forward. In reality, prices fluctuate, and sometimes significantly. The World Energy Model assesses supply of fossil fuels, including coal, oil, and natural gas, as well as traditional and modern biomass. Demand is first assessed by sector and country and region, and global supply is then modeled. Import and export needs are assessed in the model, and trade is defined based on these demand needs and global excess. Typical models in the IEA World Energy Model contain 3 fossil fuel supply modules for oil, natural gas, and coal. Oil and natural gas are linked, as many reservoirs contain heavier components and result in the production of natural gas liquids, or NGLs. These NGLs are incorporated then into the overall oil supply model. Oil, as a global commodity, is treated globally, such that supply and demand are in balance. And natural gas and coal seek equilibrium in the model on a regional basis and are considered with regional demand and trade infrastructure constraints, and then the supply is equilibrated. Price iterations that we'll dive into in subsequent sections are needed to ensure that the price assumptions that are inputted into the model reflect sufficient return on investment. In the model itself, we're going to look and explore several of the different types of oil that are modeled, as well as several of the different types of gas that are modeled. In the next section, we'll talk a bit more on both these details. First, a word on price trajectories. The World Energy Model takes international fossil fuel prices and the future pathways and trajectories and reflects the levels needed for sufficient investment in supply to meet demand. Prices are derived through iterative modeling, and their trajectories, while they appear smooth, in reality are much more likely to be volatile. The cost of supply by type of resource, location, and including technology learning curves varies for both oil and gas. This also considers how the relative risk of investment changes depending on country or region. The price of oil or gas must be sufficiently high to encourage investments in supply to meet demand. Shown here, you can see the different price outlooks that were used in the World Energy Outlook in 2019. For the current policy scenario, and this scenario, in light of the COVID pandemic, was not utilized in our WEO 2020. It had reflected essentially a business case as usual that is not as applicable in the current environment. It shows the stated policy scenario or steps that reflect a pathway that takes into account all currently stated policies from governments and industry insofar as they are sufficiently detailed and robust to have a likely probability to be achieved. And then also the sustainable development scenario. In this scenario, the SDS works backwards from the energy-related United Nations Sustainable Development Goals to achieve universal energy access for all, improve public health outcomes, and achieves a net zero emission by 2070 with about a 50% chance of limiting a temperature rise to 1.65 degrees. You can see the variations in oil price that are used and needed in each one of these scenarios. And while oil price varies widely, and I show the smooth trajectories here, they do reflect the different ways in which resources, costs, and policies all affect the supply-demand balance. In this next section, we're going to dive deeper into the fossil fuel supply module, its structure, and its submodules. Here, we detail the project resolution in the World Energy Model, specifically in the oil supply module. In the WEM oil supply module, there are 10 distinct types of oil, some of which have finer detail than others. In the crude and enhanced oil recovery sections, or subsections, we detail further the onshore, shallow, deep, and ultra deep. Other categories, such as the Arctic, extra heavy oil and bitumen, kerogen, tight oil, all have varying distance, technology, or depth categories. Coal to liquids, gas to liquids, and additives are assessed as well if sufficient price warrants. Overall, in comparison to the electricity module, the oil module is more flexible than that of electricity, but the structure that we've seen is quite similar. When we look ahead to gas, at first blush, the gas supply module appears more simplified. Currently, we're working to break apart the modules into more discrete subsectors similar to the oil module. The conventional gas module is broken apart into gas and Arctic gas, as well as unconventional gas, including tight gas, coal bed methane, shale gas, coal to gas, and hydrates. The overall structure of the module, and we're going to highlight this on the oil supply module. It first fundamentally looks at global demand. The key inputs into the module, such as historical production levels, recently sanctioned projects, remaining technical recoverable resources, costs, including finding and development, lifting costs, or OPEX, fiscal tax regimes, discount rates, and decline rates all help to govern what remaining or excess demand needs to be covered. The module is an equilibrium model and will assess what further supply is needed based on the excess demand and project economics. It works the economic calculations based on what you've seen in the preceding 2 slides, and it ranks those projects according to NPV. Then it brings on these new resources according to that ranking, subject to any logistical or resource constraints. This loop is then repeated for all regions and all oil types or all gas types. Moving from the basics of the demand and supply model, we're going to also dovetail and talk more on the NPV calculations and the investment portion of the model. When we think about replicating investment decisions in the oil and gas industry, we take a similar approach as what happens in industry in the module itself and in the model itself. We look at the net present value calculation at a project level, and then scale that up on both a regional and a global basis for oil and gas supply. Both the supply and investment modules are our economic models. We treat investment as the level of capital that is spent to develop or maintain assets. Net present value calculations are the basis of the model, as the model assesses the economic reward or loss of producing a set of resources. Let's first look at the variations in the economic model inputs by country and by region and also globally. Prices are assessed, as we spoke earlier on the oil side, with a global price. Gases see a different price regionally or by country, depending on scarcity and cost to transport. Countries have a different tax treatment regime, and we track those at the agency and team levels. Additionally, we assess the cost of capital per country and region and per resource type. This translates into an assessment of the investment risk in a country or region. Additionally, as we take a look at resources, we have different costs of supply that govern the outputs of the net present value calculation. And these are done based on the sub-modules and the subsectors in oil and gas that we saw in some of the preceding slides. The cost to produce these are impacted by learning, technology learning, by depletion, and also by inflation, which is in turn impacted by prices. Resource availability and trading and other constraints are also accounted for in the model as the model considers which projects to pick and select to develop in order to meet excess demand and build a view of global supply for oil and gas. Once the model has picked which projects to take forward, it then produces and makes the production profiles according to standards that we have set within the module itself, based on country and region, and also by access type or resource type. The resources selected for production are taken according to the standard profiles. These profiles are set up by reservoir type, extraction method, technology, and location. And shown here, we look at some examples from deepwater US, pre-salt deepwater Brazil, and you can see the differences there based on historical time to invest, develop, and bring on initial production. And then also an example of bitumen mining from Canada, which you can see takes some time to invest and begin production, but then has quite a slow and long plateau. These outputs are what define the production side in the supply module. Natural gas is facing a potential turning point in Africa. In North Africa, gas already meets around half of the region's energy needs. But in sub-Saharan Africa, it has thus far been a niche fuel. The share of gas in the energy mix is around 5%, or among the lowest in the world. Today, Africa accounts for about 4% of global gas demand and about 6% of global production. There are nevertheless several reasons to believe that the future of natural gas in Africa may be different from the past. In recent years, there have been a series of major discoveries in almost every part of the continent, notably in Egypt, in the Azore and adjacent fields, in East Africa, in Mozambique, in Tanzania, West Africa, in Senegal and Mauritania, and also South Africa. Between 2011 and 2018, Africa accounted for more than 40% of global gas discoveries. Together with LNG technology innovation, these developments could fit well with Africa's push for industrial growth and its need for reliable electricity supply. In the power sector, the rapid deployment of renewables leaves room for gas to grow as a flexible and dispatchable source of electricity. Outside the power sector, the successful industrialization rests upon the stable provision of energy, including for energy uses that are hard to electrify. So gas could be quite well suited to some of these needs. Much, however, will depend upon the pricing at which gas becomes available, the development of distribution networks, including small-scale LNG production, and the financing available for infrastructure. In our projections, Africa becomes a major player in natural gas as a producer, a consumer, and as an exporter. Today, Africa as a whole exports a similar volume of gas as Australia, and the continent's gas demand is similar to the combined demand of Japan and Korea. Production declines are the key determinant for future investment needs. Here, we see the historical global oil demand going up to 2018. So we're just shy of 100 million barrels. Moving to the future, if we just invest in current supply, if we do not further invest and just look at the declines from existing fields, you can see that there's still significant oil supply going out into the future for the next 2 decades. If we invest only in fields or only in existing fields, so essentially brownfield production, then we can see that with a fairly minimal amount of investment, oil production still will be maintained quite significantly through the 2020s and the 2030s. To look at the needs in the sustainable development scenario, we can see global oil demand emphasized by the top of the green line here in the sustainable development scenario. We can see that there's still a significant amount of investment that's needed in order to meet demand, even in a more sustainable scenario. If we take a look at the stated policy scenario, there's significantly more investment as well that's needed to both maintain the level of oil demand that we have seen or project to see potentially in the next 2 decades.
Okay, so I suggest we take some time for questions if you have. I hope you find those presentations clear and interesting. While you may be writing your question, I just wanted to share again some analysis we have conducted for the specific case of Ghana in our Africa Energy Outlook last edition, where we have tried to make projections of fossil fuel demand and production in the future. So you can see coal, oil, and gas for Ghana, and we would expect under those trajectories to see oil production to decline, but gas production to rise. Then we have different scenario as always. So the full line are based on our stated policy scenario. The Africa case, which is a scenario with higher GDP assumptions and with universal access to electricity and clean cooking, but with also less emissions, less climate impacts, and much more energy efficiency. In that case, we would see a demand for oil and demand for gas to increase further in Ghana. Demand for gas increase also to lower the use of oil in power and industrial sector. As you know, gas is less emitting than oil. And that would mean an increase also of the imports for gas, since we would expect demand to overcome domestic production by far in those projections. So again, all those analyses are available, and we are very happy to discuss more with you how we have conducted these modeling exercises and to discuss more the results. So again, I'm very happy to take any question, to give you the floor if you want to speak, if you want to share Ghana experience on the oil and gas sector, which is very interesting and very inspiring, I think, for other countries of the continent. And also for us from the IEA point of view, we are always happy to learn more and to be able to better document what is going on in the sub-region, in Ghana more specifically. So very happy to hear more from you. Okay, if there are no questions for us, I do have some for, oh, I see someone who raised a hand. Excellent, Bernice. Hi, Bernice, are you able to speak?
I don't really have a question. Hello?
Hi, yeah, Bernice, we can hear you. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I don't have a question. There's no question on my side.
Okay, anything you want to share?
Not really, please.
Okay, no problem. Thank you for showing you were here and for participating. So I have some quick polling questions for you. So I invite you to go back to the Menti website. 2 more questions. Number 1 is more a question on statistics, something that you have discussed last week with my colleague Zakia and other colleagues, looking at the refinery sector. So when you look at refineries in a country and when you measure inputs to refineries and outputs, could you expect to have gains, so to have outputs which are higher than inputs? Okay, so we have a good balance of yes and no. Actually, the answer is indeed yes and no. Yes, if you measure in terms of volume. So if you look at how many liters of crude oil entered into your refinery and how many liters of oil products like kerosene, like gasoline and LPG and others that go out of your refinery, you may have some gains in terms of volumes. But no, if you measure in energy content terms, it's not possible to create more energy as an output than what you had as an input. So in that case, it's not possible to have gains when measuring with the same energy unit. So it was everyone is right. Just you need to be clear on how do you measure inputs and outputs to the refinery. Next question, which is an open one. According to you, what can the fossil fuel supply industry do for sustainability? We've discussed a lot our trajectory for a more sustainable development world with reduction of greenhouse gases emissions. We know that the fossil fuel industry is responsible for much of those emissions. According to you, what can be done to improve sustainability of the industry? Okay, first answer, drive down the cost per barrel. So maybe this relates to the production cost. So maybe to have more efficient and to ensure that any barrel produced is produced at a lower cost or as low as possible. Another suggestion is reduce in use, new investment, develop new fields. So reduction in all that. That is indeed something that would need to happen if demand for oil reduces. We will need less supply. One other very good remark on looking at the triple bottom line. So not only economic consideration, but also social and environmental concerns. So for companies, there is indeed higher scrutiny on ensuring that they bring, along with profit and economic development, they bring social benefit and environmental, so they limit environmental impacts. Manage CO2 emissions is, of course, the end use, the end goal. How do we do that? There are several ways, but of course, that's the paradox or the dilemma that we all love energy and want energy, but we don't love and we don't want the associated CO2 emissions, which are causing, as we all know, global warming and climate change. Okay, again, managing CO2 emissions. Perfect. So we at the IEA we have been analyzing this for a while, and as we always do, starting with data, trying to track existing emissions to understand practices by the industry, by the different companies, and also we have come up with recommendations for policymakers, but also for industrial players to ensure that the industry is more and more sustainable and more aligned with the world we want, with reduction of the CO2 emissions. So Rebecca, again, will share a bit of insights on this topic. Thank you for your answers. And we will hear from Rebecca on the second part of this presentation.
In the next section, we're going to detail and step through the refinery module in a finer detail. In the refining model, we look at the key link between oil demand and supply. The module itself is broken up into 4 steps. We're going to detail some of these further in the next slide. First, on project oil demand, we carry 8 categories. And we also look at refined products demand, the overall project refinery runs, and then from these, we calculate a regional trade balance for both crude oil and for oil products. On the right-hand side, you see what we typically output for the World Energy Investment, looking at the refining capacity and runs by region, and in this case, from 2019's new policy scenario. First, on the oil products demand. We assess oil demand for each sector in a region from the demand modules and from those that we looked at earlier. Those are broken down for each oil product. So for ethane, naphtha, kerosene, fuel oil, LPG, gasoline, diesel, and also for other side products. There are some exceptions built within the categories, and those are for LPG, gasoline, and diesel, where we do some calculations outside and bring into the model based on different ways that some of these products are made. These are all worked and based on historical shares and also on some additional modeling that is needed in order to assess what are currently in marine bunkers and future projections for that. Diesel, gasoline, and LPG demand are worked in the road transport module and then transferred and put back into the refining module. LPG demand itself is also assessed in residential cooking and is determined by the access model. Project refined products demand takes a look further into the refinery runs, and those are modeled to meet projected demand for refined products at each product level. The refined products demand equals the refinery runs plus any processing gains. We show here the detail for total liquids, and within this, we have a buildup based on biofuels, total oil, broken apart into CTL, GTL, but also the direct use of crude oil, overall oil products, and then finally refinery products. Project refining capacity is built and assessed for 112 countries in the World Energy Model. This is built into and split into the crude distillation units and also the condensate splitters. All of these take a look at the model product yields and meet projected oil products demand on a global and also then a regional basis. Determined refinery runs or utilizations are based on regional cost competitiveness and also on product trade balances. These are pulled together, and we also take a look at the refining capacity at risk, or essentially what level of capacity may not be needed to meet current and future supply. These are taken into a regional trade balance for all of the crude oil and oil products. And we looked at the trade, and we look at the trade matrices of these and how trade can move between these different regions. The crude oil, or the refinable liquid side, looks at the crude and condensate supply. It takes this, it subtracts off the refinery intake, subtracts off the direct use of crude, and that equals the net import and export requirements. Oil products, on the other hand, look at the refinery output. They include product output from NGL, or natural gas liquid fractionation plants, subtract the oil products demand, and this looks at net import and export requirements. And these are done on a regional basis to come up with an assessment of the overall global crude oil market and also the product markets. The demand for oil products has shifted over the last several decades. The past challenge for refiners has been reducing from the bottom of the barrel. However, when we look at future demand, the challenge becomes more to increasing yields from the top of the barrel products, particularly as we look at product demands that are being pulled and used for the petrochemicals industry and for the plastics industries. In the last section of this module, we're going to take a look at the implications for sustainability in the oil and gas sector, and particularly on climate sustainability. If operated to reduce emissions, oil and gas could be an important source of energy for much of Africa and could enable Africa to take a more significant global role in oil and gas production. Increasingly, as more governments have announced carbon reduction ambitions, including China, Korea, Japan, the EU, the question of emissions, intensity of supply, and imports becomes even more important. The emissions intensity of the oil supply curve is shown here. We take a look at the estimated Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions for the overall crude oil, condensate, and natural gas liquid production from 2018. And as we look at this, and we look at the emissions intensity of this oil supply curve, we see that emissions from operations, including flaring and methane release, as well as emissions from transport and refining, contribute to the overall Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions from operations and transport. From this, we can also see that a relatively narrow band of production contributes an inordinately large proportion of emissions, as you look from about 85 million barrels a day and above. Extracting oil, processing it, and bringing it to consumers is an important component of global greenhouse gas emissions today. And overall, these emissions are between 10 to 30% of the full life cycle emissions intensity of oil. And turning the picture to natural gas, the same applies to natural gas. With natural gas, methane leaks to the atmosphere are by far the largest source of emissions on the journey from reservoir to consumer. Increasing attention by governments and non-government agencies have shined a light, in particular, on methane emissions. The uptick in aerial surveillance, including satellite surveillance, has helped to understand where many of the larger leaks are sourcing from. Work by the Environmental Defense Fund and several other parties has also indicated that poor flaring combustion efficiency may be a major source of methane leaks, particularly from the oil sector. These considerations, also in light of the increasing number of country ambitions to reduce carbon emissions, puts into question the need and the importance of addressing emissions in new and existing operations. Looking forward to the future, it may be the case that lower emission oil and gas may be a preferred opportunity in the global market. When we look at overall Scope 1 and 2 emissions intensity of oil and natural gas production in the Sustainable Development Scenario, we can see that methane is the #1 source of potential emission reduction and abatement. The IEA estimates that about 70% of methane can be abated at no net cost. The use of CCUS, or carbon capture, use and storage, and renewables can also help to reduce or offset emissions. Additionally, energy efficiency improvements have played a role in recent years to reduce emissions and improve efficiency and costs of oil and gas operations. Oil and gas operations on the whole account for over 4.3 million tons of CO2 equivalent released today, so nearly 15% of global greenhouse gas emissions. A large part of these emissions can be brought down relatively quickly and easily. The future is increasingly electric. However, liquids and gas still comprise over 50% of energy consumption to 2040. This also includes a role for low carbon liquids and gases, including some biofuels and hydrogen as well. When we look in the stated policy of the 2030s, we see about $1 trillion invested in liquids under $600 billion, with an increasing proportion and increasing need for low carbon liquids and gases. Overall, as we step towards the end of this module, we're going to leave you with the following conclusions. First, modeling fossil fuel supply requires information and assumptions on reserves and resources, technologies, production profiles, costs, tax regimes, many of the parameters for the NPV calculations, and including refinery, in order to assess a full supply model. Prices are needed to balance supply and demand and help to ensure that new investment is pulled into the sector. But as we model the prices, we need an iterative approach, and real pricing may be much more volatile than the ones that we project and use in our modeling. New projects are needed to come online to offset declining production, and this is needed in both more sustainable scenarios, such as the Sustainable Development Scenario, and also increasingly then in the stated policy scenario. Detail on primary and secondary products depend on the model requirements. The evolution of infrastructure can play a very significant role in this regard. And today, about 15% of global energy-related greenhouse gas emissions come from the process of getting oil and gas out of the ground and to consumers. Minimizing these emissions should be a first-order priority for all companies and countries. No oil and gas company will be unaffected in clean energy transitions. So every part of the industry, including national oil companies, need to consider how to respond.
Okay, so I see that Mr. Sylvester had some issues hearing. I hope that for all the participants it was possible to hear the last 5 minutes. Please, if not, let me know. We can discuss again those topics. And I just want to show again a bit the exercise we have sent to you, not to correct it live, but more to invite you to refer to it. So this is the handbook we have sent to you for Ghana, with a number of exercises, including one on fossil fuel supply, where we, as usually, put you in the context of trying to analyze the oil upstream and midstream sector in order to anticipate future developments of production, of refining, of trade. It relies, as usual, on historical data we have um, that will help us build our projections, and which are specific to the oil sector. In that case, we assume that based on the exercises we have done looking at transport, at industry, at residential, we would have already some information regarding what the future oil demand will be in the coming years. And this will be an information we will use to ensure that we can have a supply which meets this demand. So again, I won't go through the entire exercise, but you are basically asked to look at the refinery capacities in the countries, at the production of oil in the country based on the existing fields, but also thinking about development of new fields based on their production profile, as was discussed by and presented by Rebecca. So we now have some time for questions. Please feel free to raise your hand or to use the Q&A functionality. I'll be very happy to answer, and Rebecca will also join us in a second. Okay, Mr. Sylvester. Hi, Sylvester. If you want to raise any points, share anything, or ask a question, you can speak. Okay, Mr. Sylvester.
Hello.
Yeah, we can hear you. Please go ahead.
Okay. So I said it's been another interesting uh, network. Hello.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I could not hear. Could you say again?
Let me check my network. Okay. So that was a very good presentation. I noticed that in your classification you distinguish condensate from NGL. So my first question is there a reason for referring to condensate separate from NGLs? Because from where I sit, condensate is classified as part of NGL. So if there's any reason behind that distinctive categorization. Then number two has to do with emissions level. So I noticed that you've estimated emission from crude oil that's through the full life cycle to be 10 to 30%. But in the case of gas, you fail to give an indication of how much methane contribute to. If you can give some numbers to back that, that would be great. I have a third question. It has to do with NGOs pricing. And just to ask if there are global benchmarks, particularly for condensate, that I can make reference to in terms of my pricing activity for NGLs in general and condensate in particular. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sylvester, for your question. And hi, Rebecca. Thank you for joining us for answering those questions with our participants from Ghana.
Hi, and I apologize for coming in just a minute late. So thank you, Sylvester, for the question. I think I missed the first half of it, though. So I apologize. I don't know if you wouldn't mind repeating.
Yeah, for sure. Maybe the number 1 and 3 can be regrouped. It's about our classification of oil products, and I'll come back to the slide while we speak. The question was why are condensate distinct from NGLs? Is there a reason for making it 2 different categories? I think, or it was about this categorization of those products, and related to that, it was about prices of NGL. If there are international prices, any data or material that could guide Sylvester in his work on prices for both condensate and NGLs.
Okay, thanks. That's very helpful, Arno. On the first question with regards to the classification of oil products, it primarily has to do with the production mechanism associated with the two. And so, and at what point along the supply chain that you actually have those extracted. Condensate, and some condensate quite typically is removed almost immediately at the well site, especially in higher condensate gas reservoirs, but also in some oil reservoirs as well. Whereas NGLs quite typically are processed later on downstream and midstream processing plants. And so it's a bit of a separation between where effectively we're capturing those in the supply chain, and that impacts how we do the modeling itself for it. And subsequently, with some of those, they have some distinct paths and processes in terms of the types of markets that they go to and where they're shipped to, because the processing and refining facilities are not necessarily always the same. They can't be lumped with some of the other types of crude. And so we tend to keep the split in the same way as we move forward with these the overall supply modeling across upstream and midstream and downstream. I hope that helps with that question. On the second question, I think that a good answer is to say wherever you can get good quality data, and the answer is where can you get good quality data? And we at the IEA, we try to look at some of the larger benchmarking houses in terms of what assumptions they're putting forward. We quite often take a look at what the EIA from the US is projecting out, but we also look globally at other price forecasting and assumptions. So we look at WoodMac and IHS, and we keep tabs on Rystad and all of these different benchmarking databases, so that we get a feel of where assumptions are moving globally. Most of the markets as well are giving some short-term forecasts, looking out for the next 12 to 24 months. If you start looking at the stock exchanges, for example, and some of the crude future exchanges in and across the world. And I'm curious as well if you found any other new or additional ones that perhaps we don't tend to look at as often as well, because I would love to hear about those as well.
Thanks, Rebecca, for those specifications. Sylvester, feel free to answer directly, especially on other sources you might have and we might not be aware of.
Sorry, say again.
In terms of sources for prices for condensate and NGLs, we might not be looking at all possible sources of data. So we are very happy to take into consideration any other data or source you might have or you might be looking at from your work perspective.
Oh, okay, great. So from where I sit, and the reason why, before I come to your question, let me take it from this point. The reason why I asked the question about the categorization is that from where I say the categorization has a direct impact on the type of pricing mechanism that we adopt. So if you look at a typical processor, a typical gas processor, we have, I mean, when you move from methane, ethane, all the way to the isopentanes and the pentanes, there's one key product, which is a C6, and that is condensate. And, you know, in a typical crude refinery processes, that's through the RFCC. They also have a product known as naphtha. So naphtha share a similar category product specification with condensate, but however, the pricing of condensate is more different from naphtha. And unlike, let's say, crude, that we have international benchmarks for crude and other refined products, naphtha and condensate really doesn't have an international benchmark for pricing, because those derivatives are seen more like a byproduct, and therefore the pricing is usually at a reference to is provided just so that it competes with other international refined products. So what we do typically has to do, you look at the competitive or the alternative fuel to condensate, then you give a discount just so that it's competitive to those alternative fuel. I hope that helps.
Yeah, it does help, the specification, especially between condensate and naphtha. And I can ask our lead modeler on refining as well, if he has any other benchmarks other than the ones that I've stated. And if so, I can connect the two of you, and we can pass that information along if that's something that you're interested in.
That would be great. That would be great. That would be great. But just to add that, you know, in some of the crude oil fields during production, we also have a product in crude processing known as condensate. How different is that from, let's say, a gas condensate? I don't know if you can also throw light on that. But if that can also be done probably next week, I don't have any difficulty. That's the distinction between condensate as a byproduct from gas processing, which is C5, C6, and condensate as part of crude oil processing.
So ultimately, I don't think there's really very much difference in it. It's just on one side, the fractionation is coming from the higher end of the gas reservoirs and the output from those reservoirs. And then on the last point, in terms of the crude processing, essentially it's the same condensate. There may be a slightly different mix of exactly what type of say isotopes and things like that you're dealing with. But you're just coming at it from two different angles. So heavier oils in crude, and you're getting lighter ends on the condensate, versus in the gas reservoirs, you're capturing the higher ends. But ultimately, the product is very, very similar, or the same.
Fantastic. Thank you. Fantastic. My last question has, I think, because of the choppy nature of the network, you didn't hear that. So it had to do with emissions. So in the presentation, you gave an indication how much emission you project comes from crude oil processing. That's through the product life cycle. So an indication was given as 10 to 30%. So, good, you've even displayed that. So you said the emissions are between 10 to 30% of the full life cycle of the product. So that's for crude oil. So in the case of gas, which we think that it's a lower form of fossil fuel, so its emission is relatively lower. What would you see is the percentage of emission through the product life cycle?
Do we have that here for gas? Yeah. So here you can Between the two slides that Arna had just shown, and thank you, Sylvester, because it's a great question. Between these two slides, you can see the differences between the scope 1 and the scope 2 emissions through that. And then the difference with essentially between oil and gas is the vast difference in the scope 3 emissions and the level of emissions associated with that. I can pull the more exact number for you because I prefer to give you the best number rather than quoting one off the top of my head. But to a large degree, the difference, and especially if you say take gas to coal, ends up being that gas has a bit of a similar profile of emissions intensity on scope 1, scope 2, but the burning of the gas is much cleaner than coal and oil as well. But I can try to pull an estimate for you and send that across, because I don't know if that still covers a full 10 to 30%, or if that becomes a little bit greater because the scope 3 emissions for gas are a little bit less than for oil per se, and then significantly less for coal.
Thank you, Rebecca.
And one thing, I don't know if Arno had talked very much about it. There's a lot of work going on, both in Arno's team and my team currently. And so this week, we have just released a report on critical minerals and looking at the supply and demand of critical minerals globally and regionally, moving forward to clean energy transitions. And so I really encourage you to take a look at the IEA website and pull that. We just had the release yesterday on that. So there's a lot of people here, including myself on some of the recycling bits, that have been working hard on getting that one out. And even more so, coming up on May 18th, we have the net zero emissions by 2050, or the net zero by 2050 roadmap coming out. And so there is a very large group of great IEA staff that are working on getting that out and getting that ready. And so that one will be a very big launch for us. And there'll be a lot more detail in that report as well when it comes to fossil fuel emissions, but also how to make an accelerated view on clean energy transitions moving ahead, especially through the next decade. So I would encourage you to take a look at that. And then finally as well, and then I think there may be one more question that's popped up on the Q&A if I hadn't seen that before, is we've got a financing report for clean energy transitions coming up on June. The release I think will be on June 9th. And that one is specifically looking at emerging and developing economies. So how can we actually finance clean energy in emerging and developing economies, and try to fast track and move that forward from a financing and investment perspective. And an overall add-on to that is something that we've been doing quite typically for the last few years, is a view on global investments in energy. And that one will be coming out just ahead of the financing report. So there's a lot of work ongoing here currently, a lot of very busy people, but a lot of really good material that, depending on exactly where you're sitting and where you're working in the energy, which part of the energy realm you're working in, you might find quite interesting, quite fascinating. So I encourage you to keep watching, take a look at critical minerals, because we're quite proud of that, but also quite proud of the team here that's working hard to deliver the net NZE by 2050 roadmap, as well as the financing and investment work.
Thanks, Rebecca, for mentioning indeed those very important pieces of work. We'll make sure that you get all information on when the dates, when the books are online, and to disseminate them to our group of African experts working on energy statistics and modeling. There is one more question, Rebecca, that I think relates to the emissions, asked by Nana on does the product life cycle include recycling? I'm not sure I perfectly understand if it's what it's relating to exactly, but I don't know if you have already any insight, Rebecca, on those on the recycling related maybe to this emission topic.
Yeah, well, perhaps Nana, she doesn't mind. She doesn't mind asking, just to clarify, because I don't typically associate oil or gas associated with recycling. So I'm not sure how to. I want to make sure I'm answering the right question. And having just come from working quite a bit on critical minerals, where we do go into recycling, and the emissions associated with recycling. Well, actually, a lot of that work is covered in that report, but it does not focus to a large degree on recycling with respect to the fossil fuel industry.
Nana, you shall be able to speak.
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, I was referring to the product. For instance, if you're looking at methane, ethane, whatever products, and they are looking at the life cycle analysis. Now we've been talking about from cradle to cradle analysis and not from cradle to grave. So with cradle to grave would have just ended with, let's say, your product methane and just the end. But if it is the cradle to cradle analysis of the life cycle assessment, then we are going to also look at what do you do with the methane, for instance, when it comes to its end. Do you also consider recycling of that?
If I can turn.
Thank you very much.
It's a great question. And I think when you ask that question, I more think of ethane in particular and some of the ethane crackers and the path forward with those going into the plastics industry and recycling from that side. A bit on methane, but less so. And to be honest, I don't know that full aspect in terms of the ethane production has been included in our assessment of life cycle emissions, as we show this gas picture here in reference. So this is just showing scope 1 and scope 2. But if we were extended to scope 3, which we've been doing some work to do, I'd have to check. It's a great question, and whether that includes the recycling component of those.
Right. Thank you very much.
These are great questions. Are there any more? You've got a great group this morning, Arno.
Any other question, please feel free to raise your hand or ask using the Q&A box. Maybe also in the meantime, to mention that every month the IEA is releasing an oil market report, and every quarter or semester, I think, a gas market report. So all this is, most of the material is available. And we recently had a webinar with a colleague from this team presenting the annual oil market report. So I'll share on the groups the link to the video you can that has been recorded and that you can see again. And if I don't see more questions, well, I'd like to thank all of you for your participation this morning and for this week, which has been pretty intense with close to 8 hours of webinars on energy modeling. Thanks for bearing with us and continuing this journey to understand better how to make projections on future energy demand, transformation processes, and supply today, looking all across the energy sector and diving deep in different topics like hydrocarbons today. Thank you very much to you, Rebecca, for having presented those topics and answered the questions.
Thanks, Arno. Thanks to you for coordinating everything and for taking care of this great group that you've got here.
Any additional question you may have, please feel free to send per email, WhatsApp, or whatever mean. And we'll see. Our next webinar will be on Tuesday. We'll continue discussing energy modeling. Now, not presenting you IEA methodologies and analysis, but inviting some partners from the academic world who are also doing some interesting pieces of work on energy modeling. So we'll have Imperial College, and then we'll have Politecnico di Milano, both working on different energy-related modeling topics. So I wish you a very good day, good weekend, and talk to you next week. And thanks to you again, Rebecca, for coming today.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great weekend.
Bye-bye.